Wonderful. So welcome everyone. I'm Liz Wilhelm. I get to be the Burlington Healthy Community Coalition Program Coordinator through United General District 304. And I am just delighted that we're able to host this webinar today, our Cannabis 101, Current Evidence and Considerations. And I'm happy to introduce Alex Sorotsky, who is our presenter today. Alex and I have known each other probably since like at least 2018, maybe.
Yeah, 2018.
Yeah, I've had the opportunity to work together in a couple of different coalitions and programs. And Alex is a public health educator with the Washington Poison Center. And the Poison Center has been tracking cannabis exposure data for several years now, and has been providing education on cannabis to the communities as per questions and issues that have come up from communities following legalization. So we're really excited to be able to have Alex do this presentation. I want to thank all of the organizers or my co-hosts today. So that would also be the Seder Woolly Rise Coalition, and Sam is showing her face there. Sam, all right.
Thank you everybody for attending.
And United General District 304, there are a few of us with that organization. The North Sound Regional Youth Marijuana Prevention Program, coordinated by Whatcom County Health Department, and Alyssa is up there representing.
Hi everybody, thanks for being here.
And the Northwest Educational Service District 189, and I'm not sure if somebody is here today with us from the ESD.
I'm here.
Here's Chris. I see your box, Chris. Great, wonderful. All right, well, as you know, we're recording, and one more time, if anybody does want a certificate from today's webinar for your participation, please put your name and organization and your email address in the chat box so that we can send you a certificate after the webinar. We'll make the webinar available, the recording, in about a week's time. So if there's somebody else that you want to share it with, or you want to track back and listen to more, you'll be able to do that. And Alex will, of course, will say he's also available to do other webinars in the future. So Alex, why don't I go ahead and hand it over to you?
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction, Liz, and welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. As Liz said, this is being recorded, so totally fine with me if your camera's on, camera's off, whatever. Just note it'll be preserved forever. So do with that what you will. Another logistic, I'm still getting used to this headset, and there's another mute button here. So if you see me flailing about like I'm talking and you can't hear anything, let me know. I will not be offended, and I will quickly remedy that so you all can hear what we're saying today. Well, and like Liz was saying, we've known each other since about 2018. She was actually at the larger training, the pilot of the larger training that what you're going to see today is based off of, and it's grown a lot since then. A lot of formatting changes, a lot of research changes and updates, and it's always a work in progress. So as we're going through today, if you come across some resource you think I should be aware of to include in this, please let me know, because the nature of cannabis and marijuana research is always changing and always growing. All right, so let's dive right in. And oh, you know what? Actually, another caveat. As we're going through today, I love it when folks ask me questions. I prefer it if you just ask it in the chat box as we're going through. And then if we magically end the whole thing early, we can have folks unmute themselves to ask questions at the very end. I will do my best to kind of answer those questions as they come up or where it makes most sense within the context of the presentation. If I haven't answered your question at the end, definitely flag me down, and I'll have my email address at the end as well. You can always contact me after the fact. Okay, now here's our roadmap for today. So I'm going to talk just very briefly about the Washington Poison Center, who we are and what we do. We're then going to actually open things up with a discussion on cannabis legality and some of the history there that helps give some understanding of the bizarre legal tensions with a federally illegal substance that states are legalizing anyway. We're then going to spend some time talking about acute clinical effects. Acute means short-term, in the moment effects. We're not talking about chronic use for that portion. And I'll also share some actually fairly new Washington Poison Center data in that section. We'll then have a discussion on just some general health considerations. Part of what makes cannabis so strange and difficult is that we do have some documented therapeutic benefit, and we have a lot of documented health concerns and health risks with this. So it's both, you know, prevention messaging and medication management messaging almost when we're thinking about it from a poison center perspective. And then finally, we'll have a couple slides at the very end just on some basic communication pointers, specifically when communicating with youth. All right, let's start with the Poison Center. I hope you have heard of us. If you haven't, then you have now. So to define poison, because we take a super duper giant broad approach to the term poison at the Poison Center. I think most folks think things like arsenic and cyanide and, like, you know, murder mystery novel kind of stuff, which, yes, those are poisons. But we take like I said, a much broader approach. For us, a poison is any product or substance that might be harmful if it's used in any of these three wrong. So in the wrong way, by the wrong person, or in the wrong amount. So that's a massive list if we think about it. That can include household products, plants, cleaners, bites and stings from animals, as well as medications and other substances. So my one bit of homework for all of you right now at this moment is to make sure you remember this phone number. Write it down, put it in your phone, tattoo it on your arm, whatever y'all need. 800-222-1222. So this is the national toll-free poison helpline. It will route you to your local poison center based on your area code. We're literally always open. You can call right now, and a nurse or a pharmacist or poison information provider will answer that phone. I will not answer that phone. I don't work the phones. Y'all don't want me working the phones. I'm much better in this role. But you can call right now. You can call 2 in the morning, and one of those folks is going to answer. We're always free, so you never have to worry about billing, insurance, anything like that. And we are confidential. So I really like to stress this point. The same laws, the HIPAA laws that protect your privacy at a doctor's office, at a hospital, those apply to us as well, because we are creating a short medical record for every patient that we engage with, that we help treat. And I do want to emphasize that we're not going to report a caller to anyone else. We believe that a lot of folks hesitate to reach out because they're worried we're going to call the police, that we're going to call Child Protective Services if they didn't store something properly and their kid got into it, or some other entity to get them in trouble. And we absolutely will not. Our whole point of being is to keep folks safe from potential poisonings. And that's it. That's our interest there. So please hit me with any Poison Center questions as you have them. I'm happy to chat about it, providing there's time, but I'm going to shift toward legality. And if you can't tell already, boy, do I love building context. So something to keep in mind moving forward. You've heard me use the term cannabis a lot already. It's in the title. There are a bunch of terms for this substance, though, for this product. Cannabis, marijuana, pot, weed. It's a fascinating Google search to just look up terms for cannabis. We could spend the entire hour plus just talking about terminology and language and the different histories and stigmas and nuances with each of these terms. But we don't have time for that today. So for the purposes of today, you're going to predominantly hear me use the term cannabis and sometimes marijuana. Feel free to ask terminology questions if you have them. I'll try to get to them at the end, and I'm happy to share some resources on that as well. So, cannabis sativa. This is the scientific taxonomical term for this plant. Now, this one plant has tons and tons and tons of varieties. So something to keep, I like wacky tobacco. That was a good one. I've heard my grandmother say that, which always just makes me giggle. So thank you, Billy. So this one plant can be used to create a ton of products. Some of them, a lot of them, are drug products that lead to some level of intoxication. A lot of them are not drug products. So we can use versions of this plant to create rope and soap and food and textiles and all sorts of stuff. Now, 2 terms I'm going to revisit later, but I want you to keep in mind so that we can understand legality. The first one is THC, specifically delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. This is the main regulated and the main intoxicating component of the cannabis plant. We're going to unpack it more later. But generally, when you hear THC in terms of policy, it is referring to this specific type of THC. There are absolutely exceptions. And then hemp. This is federally defined as cannabis, so this same plant, but with less than 0.3% THC. So hold on to that, because these two terms are going to come up a lot today. All right, so we're going to go through a bit of a thematic timeline of cannabis legality. I'm a visual guy, so I like timelines. It kind of helps me wrap my head around things. So honestly, this should actually read mid to late 1800s to present. There has been some form of cannabis agriculture in the US. In the early 1900s, it was a huge agricultural product, a big export, specifically hemp. Again, this kind of low THC version of it. And again, it was used to create all sorts of other products. That does not mean that use of cannabis for psychoactive effects was not happening during this period. It absolutely was. And it just kind of helps us understand some of the early legality here. So we had a lot of commercial agriculture in the early 1900s that kind of ceased on a commercial level during the 50s and have picked back up more in recent years. And again, hemp is that low THC version of the plant. And that agriculture, even though the commercial agriculture ceased in the 1950s, illicit agriculture, sort of underground growth of the plants, absolutely continued post 1950s. That's a big part of why we have such a complicated and large cannabis industry today. All right, then we enter a real difficult period here of this fear and racism getting introduced alongside cannabis legality and cannabis rhetoric. So this is an important name to remember, Harry Anslinger. He was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Now, this was kind of sort of a precursor to the FDA, to the drug part of the FDA. Its original point was to enforce alcohol prohibition. Once alcohol was legalized in the US, this entity, this bureau, kind of opened its focus to other substances, and it really targeted cannabis. Now, I typically like to give a lot of benefit of the doubt and historical relativism and all that. And Anslinger was a really problematic fella. And there's no other way to say it. He was super duper racist. And so a lot of what he did, and this is part of why there's some tension around these terms cannabis and marijuana and what's the most appropriate to use. He took this Spanish term, marijuana, for this plant, and he linked a lot of anti-immigration and anti-Mexican rhetoric with anti-cannabis rhetoric. So rather than spreading caution about, hey, there's this substance, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, he said a lot of stuff like this. This quote here, I think, sums him up rather well. The primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effect on the degenerate races. Horrible quote, horrible comment. And I bring this up because it helps show some of the early on misinformation and stigma around this substance that makes it rather difficult to sift through what we do and don't actually know about cannabis and marijuana. He also was a big pusher and proponent of the 1936 government-sponsored propaganda film Reefer Madness. So if anyone is looking for something to do these next few days, this is available on YouTube, this old propaganda film. And we can see some of the rhetoric and imagery he was using here. So the sweet pill that makes life better, women cry for it, men die for it. Marijuana, weed from the devil's garden. We have wild parties, unleashed passions. In a syringe, I don't think cannabis is ever used in a syringe. Devil's harvest, a lot of devil imagery here. More devil's harvest, a good girl until she lights a reefer. And again, reefer madness. So we're not going to linger on all that. It is a fascinating history, though, and I think it's an important one. All right, so kind of moving along in our timeline here, we kind of jump to these periods of taxation that starts creeping in 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act. That, it's not a hard line into criminalization. It's this slow kind of gradient into criminalization. A lot of local jurisdictions were doing their own cannabis prohibition. And then we started seeing more federal crackdowns on cannabis as early as the 50s. And then by 1970, Nixon passed the Controlled Substances Act. Now, this placed cannabis as what we now call a Schedule I drug or substance. So I'll just read this verbatim. Schedule I drugs, substances, or chemicals are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Now, what that means is essentially the federal government views Schedule I drugs as any substance that does not have any medical or therapeutic benefit and has a high potential for addiction. I'm not a big fan of this term abuse, but we do see it pop up a lot. And then the year after, 1971, Nixon declared the war on drugs. So all this was happening. All this federal illegality was in place. And in 1996, California decided to legalize at the state level medical marijuana. It was the very first state to do so. And so we get this toward the end in the 90s up to present, this reintroduction of taxation through state level legalization. Now, medical marijuana, this refers to any system where that state has decided that folks can access cannabis or marijuana specifically to treat symptoms from specific ailments. Every state that does this has a completely different set of ailments that qualifies someone. So a lot of states started following suit. Washington did so in 1998. And then jumping all the way to 2012, Washington and Colorado were the first states to establish retail cannabis legalization. Now that gets rid of, that doesn't deal with any sort of medical authorization or documentation with that. It just uses an age limit. So every state, to my knowledge, that has legalized cannabis uses age 21 and up in order to legally purchase and access cannabis. So I believe this is still up to date, but the state of cannabis legality is always changing. I updated this at least a couple of weeks ago. When I did look at this, we had 37 states with some level of medical cannabis laws or infrastructure, and 18 states, in addition to Washington, D.C., with some level of retail cannabis laws. And then these gray states have no legal market, though some of them do have some levels of decriminalization. Now, with Washington specifically, Initiative 502, this is what passed in 2012 that legalized retail cannabis. With this, though, there are still a lot of things to keep in mind. Folks can only legally purchase cannabis from licensed retailers. Folks must be at least 21 years of age to purchase, possess, or use any cannabis product. And with this, it is still illegal to use in public. Enforcement is a very different discussion. It is still illegal to drive under the influence of cannabis. Washington is the only state, or one of the only states, that does not allow folks to grow at home if they don't have that medical marijuana authorization. This is an important point. It is still illegal to take legally purchased cannabis across state and tribal lines. So Oregon, for example, has fairly similar laws as Washington with retail cannabis. And it is illegal to take Washington cannabis into Oregon and vice versa. And then finally, it is still illegal to use legally purchased cannabis on federally operated lands, waters, or property within the state of Washington. So if someone is visiting Rainier National Park, for example, they should not take cannabis with them. This label right here, this little label to the right, this diamond with the green leaf in the middle, this is the Washington State Universal Cannabis label. This has to be on all legally sold products with over 0.3% THC in the state of Washington. All right, I'm going to pause for a second because I know that was a lot of information very quickly. Are there any questions specific to the legality portion we just discussed? I'm going to hydrate a little bit while you think. All right, I'm not seeing just a massive flood in the chat box, but please ask them if you have them. You can ask them later in other sections, no problem. But we're going to move on to talk about just kind of a broader overview of cannabis, the systems it affects, and some acute effects. So the endocannabinoid or endocannabinoid, depends on how you want to say it, system. Every human, every mammal has this system in their bodies. It is what we call a neuromodulatory system. Essentially, that means it intersects with a bunch of other systems in the brain and body and kind of helps regulate them, helps modulate them, tells them when to take a breath and calm down, tells them when to speed things up. So very, very large, robust system intersects with a lot of parts of the brain and body. So a cannabinoid or a cannabinoid is just any chemical compound that binds to the receptors of this system, of the ECS or endocannabinoid system. Now, there are what we call endocannabinoids. These are naturally formed and regulated and produced by the body. They're in all of you right now. You can go your entire life without ever using, seeing, touching, smoking, whatever, cannabis, and you have this system in you. You have cannabinoids doing their thing. We also have this other category called phytocannabinoids. These are plant derived and they typically come from the cannabis plant, but we also see them in some other plants. Cacao is an example of what we get chocolate from. Does not mean that you're gonna achieve THC intoxication if you have chocolate. That is not an edible. It just means that some of these compounds we can find in other plants and thus other products. There are over 100 known cannabinoids to date. There are tons and tons and tons and tons, and we're still discovering more. We're still learning more and more about this system. So the main two we're going to discuss on and off, the main one is THC, like I said earlier, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. And if you see THC in this presentation without any other qualifier, it is referring to delta-9 THC. Again, this is the main cannabinoid that leads to intoxication, that leads to that physical high. There are others we'll touch on. Now, CBD, this is cannabidiol. This is generally non-psychoactive or non-intoxicating, though it might be in larger doses. We're still learning more and more about CBD. We do know that it can alter the effects of other substances, including other cannabinoids like THC. Now, something to keep in mind, again, here I am context building and giving you caveats. There are variations of THC. And we're not going to linger on these, but it's just, I think, important to note these. Now, this first one, THCA, this is tetrahydrocannabinolic acid. This is actually a chemical precursor to THC. You can kind of think of it as inactive THC. On its own and in its own non-converted form, it generally does not lead to intoxication. However, when it is heated up, a massive proportion of it converts to delta-9 THC. So I bring this up because if you're looking at this label, for example, in this photo, and you look at this top line, THC 0.58%. That seems like an incredibly small amount of THC. Someone might think, this will not lead to intoxication. But if you look down, you see THC-A, that is 28.93%. That is a huge amount there. So looking at cannabis labels, it's important to look at the entire label. It's important to note the total THC there. They do kind of an interesting equation to get that total amount there. So that's just something to keep in mind. We're not going to do any more of THCA than that. Something else to keep in mind are these other two forms, delta-8 and delta-10 THC. Now, we're not going to linger on them today. I will say that they're tricky. They are less regulated forms of THC because, again, regulation around THC typically focuses on delta-9. So these are they're both a little different. They're both derived from hemp through some form of hemp. Again, that low delta-9 THC version of the cannabis plant. Because of this, there are a lot of legal gray areas. Hemp is no longer a Schedule I substance. It hasn't been for quite a few years. So a lot of folks argue that they can use hemp and derive these other cannabinoids from them totally legally. A lot of other folks are saying, no, absolutely not. That's completely illegal. The tricky part, though, is that because of that legal confusion, those legal gray areas, depending on the state, these delta-8 and delta-10 products are not going through the same levels of testing as the regulated, legally produced and sold delta-9 products. And then finally, I'm actually only become recently aware of this category of products we call hemp Delta 9 products. The essential idea with this is to take hemp and put it into a product where, even though it is less than 0.3% THC concentration, there's enough mass, there's enough, the total amount of that product is so large that there's enough of a dose to lead to intoxication. So this is also rather tricky and often tries to take advantage of these sort of legal loopholes and gray areas there. All right, now bringing us back to Delta 9 THC. There are, whoops, there we go. PowerPoint was being a little cranky with me. Like I said earlier, when we were defining poison, the way in which something gets into the body can absolutely have a profound effect on the effects in the body. So the main ways that cannabis or THC specifically gets into the body are through inhalation, ingestion, and absorption. So with poison centers, we see a lot of these symptoms for our calls with THC. And this is not a comprehensive list. This list is always growing or always finding more, but it's not uncommon to see or to hear about folks just feeling really sleepy, really lethargic, really tired. Euphoria can be a very common acute short-term symptom of cannabis use. Now that we think has to do with, or at least in part has to do with the release of what we call dopamine in the body. Cannabis and THC can release a lot of dopamine. Dopamine is one of our body's rewarding mechanisms. So if you are really hungry, for example, and you have a really good meal, that feeling of contentment and satiation you have after you finish eating, chances are your brain is pushing that dopamine button like crazy because it's saying, yes, you are hungry and you ate food. Let's reward that. That is necessary for our survival. So THC and a lot of other substances can kind of tap into that system. All right, we can also hear impaired time estimation being a thing with THC use and THC intoxication, loss of social inhibition, this very broad category of altered mental status. So this could be as simple as some acute paranoia that someone might be feeling. It could be as intense and complicated as THC-induced psychosis, which seems to be rare as far as poison center calls go and can happen. Decreased motor coordination. Folks, this is a huge one. Please, 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 please do not use THC and drive. Please do not use other cannabinoids and drive. Any sort of cannabis intoxication absolutely impairs our ability to drive safely. It's not uncommon to see increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. We can see some issues in the stomach, dilated pupils, some kind of decreased tone in the muscle, this kind of floppiness in the muscles. And then in rare cases, we have come across temporary comas. These cases, to my knowledge, are cases of little kids who had gotten into a concentrated THC product and ended up in temporary comas. Now, yes, great that those were temporary and less great that they were a coma. Not so good there. All right, now I'm seeing a question in the chat box. What's an example of a hemp Delta 8 food product? I've seen, this is just anecdotally, this is just some of what I've seen online. And Liz, feel free to chime in here too. I know you've been on a lot of these threads. I've seen like candies that say Delta 8. I've seen other like gummies are a really common one.
The hemp part, you're saying it needs to be a volume. It's like a volume issue with the hemp derived Delta 8, separate from just Delta 8.
Here, let me back up to that slide. The hemp derived Delta 9 products, is that what you're talking about?
Oh, I'm sorry, Delta 9, yeah, yes.
For sure, no problem. I know it's confusing. There's so many deltas. It's always changing. But an example of that I saw was a power bar, because power bars are so dense. Just the total amount of hemp in there had enough of a THC concentration to lead to intoxication.
Got it.
All right, great question though, great question. So let's move on. Oh, and great questions, folks. I'm gonna hold on to talking about absorption and dabbing until a little bit. We're gonna have a modes of use section soon. So hold on to those questions. All right, so this is actually fairly new poison center data. I haven't been able to say that in a while, but do take it with a grain of salt because I did some analysis on this. Our data analyst hasn't been able to yet. So this is not yet published. This is not on our website yet, but y'all get a nice little a prequel to some of our data. And even if some of the specific numbers are slightly off, the general trends should be accurate. So this is all confirmed exposure cases to the Washington Poison Center between 2019 and 2020 by age category. So you can see by and large, most of our cases are for little kids, which makes sense. Kids explore the world by putting everything in their mouths, causes a whole heap and load of stress for their families and their guardians. And cannabis is no exception, especially when we have so many edible-like products that are candies and cookies and chocolates. And we do see other cases with other age groups as well. The second highest age group would be just this really broad, adult category. And then we do see some in older adults as well. Now, this next slide will show you some of the reasons, not all the reasons. This is just a handful of reasons why we get some of these calls based on these age groups. So when I say accident, I'm actually combining a few other categories here, but essentially what we're saying is that patient, that individual did not intend to take in cannabis. They grabbed a piece of candy thinking it was just candy, or they were a little kid and were curious and just put it in their mouth, or someone had a pot brownie not realizing it had cannabis in it. Those kind of cases. Now, medication errors, yes, are a type of accident, but I've extracted those separately. So those are two different things for this graph here. So almost all little kids fall into this accident category. I don't know much about the specific cases where you see the 3 intentional abuse cases. When we say intentional abuse at the Poison Center, we mean intoxication seeking behavior. So I don't know a lot about what was actually going on with those, 3 6 to 12-year-olds and that one medication error for the 6 to 12-year-old. But as we get into these other age categories for 13 to 17-year-olds, for example, we see a lot more of those intoxication seeking calls. All right, any data questions before I move on to, actually another data slide, but it's about CBD.
Alex, there was a question about the use of the word absorption. Do you mean something like lotions that have THC in them?
Yes, so I'll actually speak to absorption and some of the examples of that later on in this section. So we're getting close to it. But yes, that is an example of we call them topicals. So that's one type of product that it could be like a lotion with THC or other cannabinoids in it. All right, so this is similar data, but it's just on CBD. Those previous cases, it was all THC. This again, I'm including it just to show it. So, we are tracking it. The total numbers are super duper low, though I cannot figure out what led to this massive CBD increase for 0 to 5 years. It's 21 cases is not a total, not a huge total of cases, and it's a pretty big increase from the previous year there. All right, so now let's dive into modes of use. So again, thinking about the ways in which cannabis gets into the body, we're going to start with inhalation. And this will at least somewhat address your question on dabbing earlier. So inhalation, it's just breathing it in. So breathing in particulate matter from cannabis. So that's typically in the form of smoke or vapor or aerosol. We typically say aerosol more than vapor when we're talking about vape products. Vaping implies water vapor, and there's a whole heck of a lot more in here than water. So common modes of use here, smoking, that is just literally lighting the plant material on fire and breathing in the smoke there. Common forms include pipes, bongs, joints. A joint is a cannabis cigarette. I'm seeing a question here. 0 to 5-year-olds and CBD ingestion of edibles left unsecured by parents. Most likely, yes. Almost all of those little kid exposure cases are ingestion. Some mostly of edibles, but often of other forms. It could, if it was a CBD balm or a CBD cream or something, a kid might have put that in their mouth. So whoops, let me jump back there. Sorry, folks, didn't mean to click that. Vaping, like I said, this is inhaling an aerosol, which is small oil particulate matter from either heated plant material or a heated concentrated product. And then dabbing is a little strange. Some folks will argue that dabbing and vaping, those terms can be used interchangeably. We often see dabbing used with a lot more heat than vaping. So it's the same kind of idea as vaping, but it's specifically with concentrates, not with plant material. Again, it's often very, very high heat, and it's typically pulled through water in some form, similar to a bong, to kind of condense in the cool. Something to keep in mind with dabbing, though, is because it's using a concentrated product and it's often using very, very high heat, it is incredibly potent. So it can release even a larger, what we call plume, a larger amount of aerosol when it's heated up more, and can theoretically have a more profound effect, a deeper effect. The vaping aerosol includes a lot of what we call ultra fine particles. Those can bypass the defenses in the lungs quite thoroughly, far more so than a lot of smoke particles can. So inhaling, whether it's smoking, vaping, dabbing, can enter the bloodstream very, very quickly, within seconds or minutes. And I mentioned this earlier, we're going to get either dry flower or concentrates for a lot of these methods here. So dried flower or bud is a common term there. That's a less concentrated form of cannabis compared to the concentrated products. It tends to have 5 to up to 30-ish% THC. I think Washington's average is around 20% THC for our legally sold products. Concentrates come in a variety of forms. They could be oils or waxes. And there's a range anywhere from 50 to 85, sometimes up to 90% THC there. I am recognizing the time here, so I'm gonna move a little faster than I have been. Keep asking the questions, folks. I'll try to integrate answers as I can. So ingestion, this is eating or drinking a cannabinoid containing product. This is typically edibles, sometimes cannabis beverages. It is technically possible to ingest other forms of cannabis. It may or may not cause an effect if it hasn't been heated up or prepared or processed correctly. But consuming or ingesting edibles absolutely can lead to intoxication. Hallmark of edibles and other forms of ingestion here, it can take a lot longer to actually hit the bloodstream. So inhaling is seconds to minutes. Ingesting is, up 2 to 4 hours, sometimes earlier, sometimes further out, just depending on the person there. Absorption. So this is getting to your question earlier. So this is the application or transfer of cannabinoids through different membranes. So tinctures are a very common form. These are typically placed under the tongue. It's an oil, and it moves through the membranes in the mouth. It can enter the bloodstream a few minutes to an hour, just sort of depending. If swallowed, they act a little more like an edible. Topicals. This is the lotion kind of idea you were asking about earlier. Lotions, creams, balms, ointments. With the exception of something called a transdermal patch, these are typically not intoxicating. These typically do not lead to someone getting high unless it has the transdermal patch. That adds other chemicals to the mix that kind of opens up the pathways in your skin. The onset of effect has a huge range with those, though. So 2021 THC poison center data, most of our calls, a little over half of our calls were edibles. A part of why might be this label here. So this is the not for kids label. This has to be on all legally sold edible or THC containing beverages sold in the state of Washington. And that is the poison center number there. That logo does not have to be on other THC containing products. So about a quarter of our calls or our cases were for plants, and then less for concentrates and this kind of other category. All right, I'm going to push on through to health considerations. Yes, there is a size requirement for the signage for that logo there. I cannot remember off the top of my head, but that information is available on the Liquor Cannabis Board website. So the endocannabinoid system, once again, it does a whole lot. And because so much of what it's doing is regulating things and telling systems to calm down, it is incredibly active during adolescence. So we think that by focusing on some of these chemicals in the brain and body, it indirectly has this effect on anxiety and stress behaviors, how we learn, how we store memory, our sense of reward, and so much more. So the general concern is what happens, during this very crucial period of brain development if we add these external cannabinoids into the mix. There's just a concern of long-term consequences. And this is true for nearly every substance. The earlier continual use is initiated in one's life, the greater their risk of developing that physical dependence process. All right, so I'm going to go through and show you a few different evidence statements that you're going to see a big letter grade in the upper right corner of some of these slides. That corresponds with the level of evidence behind that statement. So you're going to hear me hang out in the plain language section, we have a limited amount of evidence to suggest the fact, because that's really boring. So here we go. These are my two sources, a 2017 review and a 2020 review. I really want both of these updated because I want to update my slides. All right, the one and only conclusive statement you get to hear from me today is actually on a therapeutic correlation. We know that certain cannabinoids are an effective treatment of nausea and vomiting, specifically for folks receiving chemotherapy. That's what this research looked at. It would likely apply to other sources of nausea as well. This evidence is from oral synthetic THC medications. They are FDA approved. Nabilone and dronabinol, and they so closely mirror the chemical structure of THC. It's very likely that organic delta 9 THCA, however you want to say that, would lead to this effect as well. All right, so we very likely know, lower level of evidence here, that some cannabinoids are an effective treatment for chronic pain management. This evidence mainly comes from actually outside of the United States. There's a product called nabiximols that is used currently in Europe. I believe it's still undergoing trials in the US. I need to follow up on that. And I believe it's about a 1-to-1 ratio of THC and CBD. All right, moving down the level of evidence here. So we probably know that cannabis use, this is specific, THC is what was used in the study, is correlated with improved management of short-term sleep disturbance. Big emphasis on short-term. Pretty much any medication or substance used to help with sleep works in the short term. Sleep aids are notorious for developing dependence and tolerance. And so folks typically need to use more and more and more and more of that substance to maintain the effect that they're after, in this case, sleep management. Few respiratory considerations. So we have on one hand kind of set up here, we very likely know of a link between heavy cannabis smoking and the development of premalignant lesions in the airway. Premalignant means precancerous. We also very likely know of a correlation between cannabis smoking and worse overall respiratory symptoms, including coughing, wheezing, phlegm production, and more. However, we have not yet established a connection between, like a robust connection between smoking cannabis and the development of head, lung, and neck cancers. Very strange. We would expect to see that more following the premalignant lesion development there. All right, moving on to some mental health categories. Oh, and I'm just seeing in the chat box, Mary Sagawa, thank you so much for sharing the LCB Not for Kids logo there, or the symbol there. Wonderful. All right, so schizophrenia and psychosis. We actually have some more evidence for this. We very likely know that cannabis use is linked with the development of schizophrenia or psychosis. There's more and more evidence coming out about this all the time. We believe, though, that this is not a causation kind of phenomenon. We believe that this is acting as a catalyst for those who are at risk for developing psychosis or schizophrenia, and that this seems to bring about those symptoms earlier on than they otherwise would. Weirdly, though, and this is a great example of why we just always need more research here, is that for those who have a diagnosed psychotic disorder, history of cannabis use is linked with improved cognitive performance. So this is a bit of a double-edged sword. It seems that for a lot of folks, it may bring on these symptoms earlier, and for some folks, it may have some protection for cognitive performance later on. Very, very strange there. Oh, and if folks are curious, I do have the sources in the notes sections here, so folks can check out those larger publications I'm referencing. They are publicly available. Now, a bit on anxiety and depression in adults. We may know that there is a link between cannabis use and the development of anxiety disorders. It's not as robust as evidence, though, as we see for depression. We see a stronger link for depression there. Now, this is a bit of a tough slide, this next slide, and just a content warning, I will need to discuss suicide and suicidality. So we probably know that cannabis use is correlated with suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and suicide completion. Again, we cannot say that cannabis use is causing suicide. It could be common risk factors leading to both, and we do see this correlation. I think it's important to note. And as a general rule, when it comes to contacting the Poison Center, if there is a concern of self-harm or any other overdose situation, providing the individual or the patient is responsive, so they're conscious, they are breathing, and they're not having a seizure, we recommend calling the Poison Center first, because we can link you to the hospital. There's a lot we can do on the back end. But if someone is not responsive, if they are not breathing or they are having a seizure, please bypass the Poison Center and call 911 right away. And then I have included just a couple suicide crisis lines here. So the Crisis Connection 24-hour crisis line is listed there, same with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. All right, and we're getting close to the end, folks. I have to include a little bit on intoxication and driving. I know a lot of folks here have been a part of these discussions. I know there's more and more data with Washington State and impaired driving fatalities. And a lot of our impaired driving fatalities, even though our alcohol-only DUI rates are going down, it seems, are polysubstance. That means using multiple substances. DUIs and fatalities are going up. And the most commonly combined substances are cannabis and alcohol. So we've known that there's a concern for using cannabis and then driving for a long time, but we're getting data to back it more recently. So I believe this comes from that Colorado report I referenced. We very likely know that for less than weekly users, so folks who don't use a lot, a THC blood level of 2 to 5 nanograms per milliliter of blood is likely to impair driving. Why that's important, and correct me if I'm wrong, folks who work in enforcement here, but I believe Washington's legal threshold for driving with THC level in the blood is 5 nanograms. So that range is important. We also very likely know that for less than weekly users, smoking more than 10 milligrams of THC is likely to impair driving. Now, dosage is very tricky when we're talking about different forms of THC, but to frame this, most commercially available joints or cannabis cigarettes contain way more than 10 milligrams of THC, significantly more than 10 milligrams. And then I mentioned polysubstance use a moment ago, excuse me. We very likely know that combining both increases the impairment more than either substance alone. There's a bit of a bizarre phenomenon with Washington drivers in the past few years where someone who uses cannabis and then drives will often report, well, I was trying to sober up from alcohol. And I do want to clarify that does not work that way. Piling on other substances typically just increases intoxication and decreases our ability to gauge our own sobriety. So please do not try to use cannabis to sober up from alcohol. It does not work that way. All right, and finally, because we've mentioned CBD just a couple times, I do want to acknowledge some of the potential health risks with CBD. CBD is showing up in some FDA-approved medications. Epidiolex is one. It can be very, very helpful for certain folks with certain types of epilepsy. And there is a concern for liver injury with chronic heavy use of CBD. The liver breaks down most substances and toxins in the body. CBD might actually interact with some of the enzymes needed to break down toxicity. So CBD, one of the concerns there is that it can potentially interact with other medications, with other substances. Now, this is a report from a couple years back. The WHO did not find any dependence potential, or at least not much dependence potential for CBD, and they noted the concern with medication interactions. And one of the general concerns with CBD is that there are so many misleading, false, and unproven claims, especially medical claims about CBD. And if folks try CBD to help with some medical concern without going through proper diagnosis and treatment, they may delay getting that important medical care for whatever it is they're struggling with. All right, folks, we're getting toward the end. I got a couple slides just on communication specifically to youth. Now, this is kind of a compilation of findings from 2 rounds of a listening session from Public Health Seattle, King County a few years back. One round was on vaping, typically had to deal with vaping nicotine products, but had some overlap in THC products. And another had all to do with cannabis and marijuana. Now, they were really intent on making sure not to ask these kids, do you use the substance? No, they were trying to understand what kids thought about the substance, where they got their information, what they thought their peers were using, and so on and so forth. So when they were talking about how do you want to be educated, how do you want folks to talk to you about these substances, these were some of the answers that youth by and large reported that they wanted to know the facts. They wanted to know unbiased info on health effects, both short and long term. They wanted to know mechanisms of substances, so how the things worked in the body. And they wanted accurate, honest research about risks and benefits. They wanted open discussion with accurate information. So maybe not me lecturing at them, but having that more one-on-one nuanced discussion with someone they trust. That could be any sort of influential adult. That could be a parent, a religious leader, a teacher, a coach, whoever it might be. They did not want scare tactics. They did not want exaggeration or shaming. And again, they did not want lectures. And I just love this last line at the bottom here, that the youth are smart. Youth are aware that most sources of info have some agenda, including health educators like myself, and including folks who may work in the industry. Final communication slide. This is a video linked here. I encourage everyone to check it out. I think it's like 25 minutes long. It is from the Rescue Agency, and they do just some pretty cool work on marketing and media and counter marketing. And they have this video, it's a little optimistically titled, called Marketing Health to Teens in a Post-COVID World. We're not post-COVID yet, and I think these strategies are really excellent. So their first recommendation was to acknowledge potential obstacles to addressing a health behavior and providing ways to overcome it. Most kids, or a lot of kids, are aware of health risks with substance use, and they're trying to meet some need. They're trying to cope with something, with some stress. And so it's not enough to just say, hey, this is bad for you, or this could be bad for you. There needs to be more. There needs to be more of that one-on-one connection with that youth to understand the ways, alternative ways that they can get their needs met. This next point, it can be very important to reframe behaviors around short-term benefits. So not saying, if you stop using cannabis now, you're going to decrease your risk of potentially developing psychosis later in life. But reframing around, if you do quit smoking cannabis now, you are likely going to increase your lung capacity. And like for an athlete, for a musician, that may be very relevant risk messaging. Explaining science without judgment, very similar to what I was saying earlier, being honest and open about what we do and don't know. And then finally, focusing on repeated use, not one-time use. And this is tricky. So much of our data is one-time, or at least one-time use. We look at a lot of, recent use defined as using once within the past 30 days. What this can do, though, if we're focusing all of our messaging around, if you use cannabis once, your risk of fill in the blank goes up this much. then any kid who has just used a few times, experimentally, socially, whatever it might be, they feel lost by that messaging because it's like, well, I've already used, I already have the risk now. And so focusing on the potential of continued use, of repeated use, can be a lot more powerful. All right, folks, I know those last 20 minutes was like drinking a sip of water from a fire hose, but we are at the end. So once again, massive thank you to the other organizers here. Huge thank you to Liz and the Burlington Healthy Community Coalition and all the others listed here. Once more, in case you forgot to write it down earlier, there's the Poison Center number. And as a final reminder, please place your name and email and organization in that chat box if you want a certificate. And Liz, I hope it's okay I put your email address there in case anyone emails you after the fact there. All right, now I'm going to breathe for a second and look through the other questions because I think I missed a couple. And please feel free to hit me with more in these next few minutes. And I'm happy to stay on after 3 if folks would like and answer more questions.
Oh, that's great, Alex. There were some logistics questions. Would we be able to get your slides, get a PDF
Absolutely.
of your slides to be able to share? Great, great.
Absolutely.
So if folks do want a copy of the slides, make sure your email address is in the chat box. But I'll also make it available to our to the other co-hosts and organizers. So if you found out about this webinar through, say, through Alyssa or through Jill Duvall or through Chris Jury, they could be contacts also if you later have questions or you later decide that you want copies of the slides and didn't include your email. So so know that those of us who are organizers will have access to that to be able to get that out to you all. So Alex, did you see some of the questions? There was some questions about potency and the probably the UW research that was done on that.
Yeah, so I'm backing up a little bit just to make sure I haven't forgotten any. I see one, I'm backing up to earlier. What does heat do to vaping? I think a part of it when we're talking about dabbing is having that higher level of heat just releases more. It releases more of what's already there. Are there other chemicals in dabbing? Absolutely. So concentrated products even typically have a lot of other fillers, have a lot of other chemicals involved in order to achieve the correct suspension of the THC in that product. There's a bit of a link here. This is going back in time a bit, but a Valley, which there was a lot of hype about before COVID, there was a big concern about vitamin E acetate, which was another filler, another chemical added to a lot of these vaping and dabbing products as a cause for that lung damage there. Thank you again, Mary, for adding the size requirement for the signage there. Oh, and there was a thank you, Trillium, for adding that ADAI publication. I appreciate that. And then some of that, some of the research on linking schizophrenia and psychosis development with cannabis use, some of that were in the larger reports. And there was oh, Liz, I am totally blanking. There was a bigger report, I think a couple years back, that dealt with residents of Holland, I believe, right? Like there was a larger European study that came out there. So I can try to find that and include that in the list of all the things coming your way, folks. What else did I miss? I think I got the ones I saw.
Alex, there's one question. Can you smell dabbing when it's being used, when it happens?
What a great question.
Odor?
I believe so, which would make sense because, cannabinoids are a lot of the times with these products, they also have what we call terpenes. Terpenes are essentially aromatic compounds. So they're linalool, for example, is the thing in lavender that makes it smell like lavender. And these terpenes pop up in cannabis all the time. Sometimes they're part of the plant itself. Sometimes they are purposefully added to the concentration. So to your question, whether it's vaping, smoking, dabbing, there is typically an odor there. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, we've also been really fortunate that Mary Sagawa has been on the webinar, who is with Public Health for the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board. And you could always get in touch with her if you have questions. And so she responded to the advertising size question. She also wanted to note that, of course, there is when we're talking about medical authorization, that something to also keep in mind is that people under the age of 21 can use with medical authorization. And so not to confuse things, but that is allowed in our state law on that.
Right. Thank you. Thanks for bringing that up, both of you.
Sure.
I haven't looked at that data in a while. It was a couple years back. I was trying to find the numbers of how many minors are on that who have the medical cannabis authorization. It was very few. It was a very, very small number at that point in time, at least. I'm not sure where it is these days.
So Alex, do you think that you'll be incorporating some of the most recent healthy use survey data, the 2021 data, in future presentations?
I hope so. The forever conundrum with this is that there's always so much to say in 60 minutes.
Right.
So like Liz and I were saying earlier, the earlier version of this was like a 4-hour massive TOT. So there's a lot to go through. But yeah, the newer HYS data is very, very intriguing.
So in about a week's time, we'll have the video of this webinar, the recording of this webinar. We'll post it on the Burlington Healthy Community Coalition. And again, I'll let the other co-hosts know about it so that they can share out where the link is available. But you could always get in touch with Alex as well, who is willing to do future webinars like this. So feel free to contact Alex. Alex, I think you also have some recordings on the Washington Poison Center website.
Yeah, we have a YouTube channel, we have a Facebook, we have a Twitter and Instagram. We got all sorts of. We don't have a TikTok though. There's, I haven't yet been dancing on TikTok yet. But yeah, we do have recordings of some of our other presentations over other topics as well. And if you're ever just curious to see if the Poison Center offers trainings on other topics, please shoot me an email. And if we don't have it yet, it could be something we might be able to put together, just depending on the topic.